Welcome to another Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition live stream. I am your host, Evan Zimmerman, UPEC Vice President, with my co-host, Horst Schmidt, UPEC President. We have a special message tonight, Horst.
Yes, just, with the Ukraine war, we want to give homage to American democracy and, the people who are suffering and the people who are fleeing, trying to stay afloat during this terrible time, creating refugee disaster and environmental destruction, which is going on because wars don't care what they ruin as long as they win. So, but the biggest problem from our point of view is the possibility of a nuclear disaster. Today, there's fighting around one of the 4 Chernobyl-type reactors that supply half the electricity to Ukraine, and they've existed since the 1989 dissolution of the Soviet Union. So that's an extra 33 years that they've been around. So safety is a big issue, and having the Russians perhaps hitting the reactor and creating a disaster is very great. And then for some reason I have not heard, Chernobyl was one of the first places that the Russian army went for whatever reason, and by going there they created possibility of raising, for example, radioactive dust, and who knows what they're trying to do with that reactor. So just to make us aware that there are some major issues that can affect the whole world, and at the same time we have to realize that the people of Ukraine are going through this traumatic experience. So we hope that this ends up in a way that is more equitable for the Ukrainians. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, especially in relation to Chernobyl, we know that the Russians opened up the site because there was a measurable, massive increase in radiation. Don't know what it was for. It could have been for inspection. Some people worry that it was to extract material for weapons or make Chernobyl itself into a weapon. But I think we have a special kind of responsibility here, environmental activists, because the movement for environmental advocacy and nuclear disarmament have been tied together for a long time. And, unfortunately, we still haven't been able to disarm. And now we're seeing all of the things that my heroes have been warning about for a long time. And I think that we all have to work together to remove nuclear weapons like this. And the humanitarian crisis is something that we all have a responsibility towards. So thanks, Horst.
Okay, thank you. All right. Here's the shot of our author's book, Climate Ghosts. And beautiful cover with the loons floating in the water. And our speaker is Professor Nancy Langston of Michigan Technological University. And the title of the book is Climate Ghosts, and the subtitle is Migratory Species in the Anthropocene. So, Nancy Langston's is well known in the Houghton community, and she is from Wisconsin, where she got her degrees, I believe, and also did biological research, and eventually turned towards environmental history. And so we're fortunate in having a person who's dealt with these issues for quite a while. One book that I read before was Sustaining Lake Superior, which I think is an excellent book that gets us into the chemical issues that have arisen over the decades in Lake Superior. And in a sense, this new book is an opportunity for her to expand in a direction that gives us an idea of what human activity is doing to populations. And so I want to ask Professor Langston if she could tell us how she came up with the idea of climate ghosts. Go ahead, please.
Thanks so much, Evan and Horst, for that generous introduction. And thanks to everybody who's here on Zoom and also on Facebook live stream, which I can't see, but that's cool that you're there as well. So what I'm going to do tonight is give a 35-minute talk about caribou. And this book looks at 3 different species: common loons, lake sturgeon, and caribou. And tonight I'm going to focus the slides and the more formal part of the talk on woodland caribou. But of course, I'd be delighted to talk if there's time afterwards, or if people want to stick around and ask questions about sturgeon and loons after that. So I'm going to share my screen now. And then so many things on a little laptop screen. So somehow we ended up at slide 12. Here we go. So again, thanks. And as Horst said, this is based on my most recent book, my 5th book, called Climate Ghosts, a book in which I explore the entangled histories of developments underlying the Anthropocene, focusing on climate change and its effects on the relationships humans have formed with migratory wildlife. So I'm looking at 3 migratory species, and I want to ask, how will we need to rethink our relationships to wildlife if we wish to see those species persist in the rapidly warming boreal north? So I'm going to focus on migratory woodland caribou today, in part because in the Great Lakes region, most people have really forgotten that woodland caribou were once the most widespread of the deer genus. They once roamed most of the northern forest, all the way from Maine down to Mackinac Island in Michigan, over to the prairies in Minnesota, all the way up to Hudson's Bay. And now they're almost extinct in many of their populations. But still, the landscape remains threaded with their ghosts. You can see petroglyphs of caribou, stories, place names, islands in the lake. You can go to a lousy coffee shop named after them. And there are few lone individuals persisting. So when a species has become almost just a ghost, what scholar Dolly Jorgensen calls an endling, when it's close to extirpation, can and should we still restore it? And my larger question is, what do climate ghosts tell us about our future in a warming world? So woodland caribou have been the focus of nearly a century of restoration efforts, yet they still remain at risk in the northern landscapes. Industrial development is part of the issue, but development alone doesn't quite explain why so much effort has been expended to protect the species, but with relatively little benefit. So I argue that it's really important for us to look at the historical legacies of earlier management approaches, and particularly look at indigenous dispossession. Because if we don't do that, we'll really constrain options if we don't examine those legacies of the past. So I actually came to write this book when a group of people from the Michigan First Nations community called and asked me to get involved in what they thought was about to be the extirpation of the Lake Superior caribou population.
Professor Langston, could I interrupt you for just a second?
Yeah,
I think your mic shifted. We lost some audio quality there.
Oh, okay. How about now?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, it fell down. Okay, so anyway, the Lake Superior population was on the verge of extinction. And, you know, each summer for 18 years, I've spent most days in a kayak, and I paddle almost every day along Lake Superior Islands, where these caribou once calved. And I never realized that caribou were incredibly abundant at one point and widespread. And I hadn't realized that caribou migrations threaded waters and islands, forest and bog, predator and prey, together across what eventually became the Canadian-US border. So although their annual migrations weren't as long as the barren ground caribou in the Arctic, woodland caribou were wanderers. In this region, they calved on Canadian islands, wintered in bogs to the south, and they were real survivors. Even as climate regimes dramatically shifted in the Pleistocene, woodland caribou actually managed to persist for more than 1.6 million years of dramatic climate changes. When glaciers advanced during the ice ages, caribou migrated away from the glaciers. They found refuge in what's now the Southern Appalachians. And when temperatures warmed really abruptly, they adapted because they could migrate. They moved north with their human partners along the edges of the melting ice. But now woodland caribou are really struggling. In the US, they're functionally extinct. In Canada, of 50 woodland caribou populations, more than half are in steep decline. And the litany of losses is really all too familiar. Extinct in Wisconsin by 1850, in mainland Michigan by 1912. They persisted on Isle Royale a bit longer. Then the Lake Nipigon and the north shore of Lake Superior began its steep decline in 1920 when the railway arrived. After World War II, mineral development, mining, forest logging, energy development in the Canadian North intensified and really fragmented their populations. As Leo Lapiano, Lands and Resource Consultation Coordinator for the Michipicoten First Nations community, told me, they've been driven off the land. So just a couple quick images. This was the range of North American woodland caribou, so not just the Upper Great Lakes, Lake Superior population I'm focusing on tonight. So this was early 20th century after a fair number of losses actually of habitat. And this is the current population range. And you can see they're really being pushed northward. So as I mentioned, it was in May 2018, woodland caribou were declared functionally extinct in the United States. So there were 3 lone females left in the Selkirk's Mountain of Idaho, just 3 left. And Quebec that same year washed its hands of one of the most important genetically distinct populations, basically saying, trying to protect them from extinction is, quote, a waste of money. They said, we're not going to pay, quote, $76 million that the ministry estimates is necessary to protect the Val-d'Or caribou. The minister went on to say, it's a sad situation, but we have to be reasonable. Blocking economic activities on the land occupied by caribou could cost the region up to 187 direct and indirect jobs. So they're essentially deciding to let a subpopulation, genetically distinct population, go extinct just for 187 indirect and direct jobs. So back in '89, the province had designated just over 2,000 square kilometers of forest, which is not very much for a migratory species. This tiny little bit is a protected zone for that population, but they decided to open up half of that to clear cutting and mining, which makes it not very useful for woodland caribou. Alberta, where some of the healthiest caribou populations had persisted in the last decade, they've really been pressured by tar sand leases. You can see here, caribou ranges, sorry, whoops, I'm not sure how well it's coming out, but the black lines are overlapping the oil and gas leases, the pink lines here, you can see them a bit better. The provincial government granted these leases in the last decade for tar sands development, even though they're supposed to be protecting caribou, and that's caribou range. In the ministry, they suggested that woodland caribou are, quote, doomed by climate change. So what's the point of protecting them when those resources could be spent on wildlife with a better chance of a future? So part of my book is asking, what does it mean to lose woodland caribou? What does it mean, say, to Canada's image of itself? It's on their 25-cent coin. In the US, many of us have forgotten we once had woodland caribou in the mainland US, but Canadians still see it like loons as part of their perception of themselves. And a lot of Canadians are really furious when they think their ministries are just giving up on the species, essentially just observing their decline instead of taking action to stem that decline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this Lake Superior population, which I bet a lot of you like me had no idea was around. So it still actually persists in the Lake Superior Basin. But in 2018, that last population, there had been 2,000 of them, and they dropped to less than 24 individuals really quickly. Massive drop of the last population in this area. And they were trapped on Michipicoten Island, on one single island in Lake Superior, with a pack of wolves that couldn't get off the island because ice wasn't forming often enough. So 2 wolves, they started out as 2 wolves, but it was a male and a female, and soon there were 20 wolves. And trapped on the island, wolves did what wolves do. They ate the caribou that couldn't get away from them either. And so the remnant was once part of an eastern population that had ranged really, really far north. They had used to migrate all the way up to James Bay. And at this point, they were really cut off. They were not able to migrate north anymore. There was a lot of development between Lake Superior, where they could find some refugia, and Hudson's Bay. And they were increasingly pressured by wolf populations, which were increasing for a number of interesting reasons that we can talk about if we have time. But essentially, the development that's been happening in the boreal forest is creating avenues. Every time there's a logging road, a gas pipeline, infrastructure put in, it gives wolves a really good pathway into the snow. They cannot run through super deep snow, which caribou can, but even a snowshoe trail in the boreal forest gives wolves entryway into the forest, into the bogs where caribou find refugia. So caribou had co-evolved with wolves. So why are wolves an issue now? Biologists were asking. So unlike moose, which are much bigger and they stand their ground and kick a wolf that's trying to attack their calves, caribou have evolved a strategy of fleeing from predators, of fleeing into deep snow and wetlands. They're really a wetland dependent species and an island habitat dependent species. White-tailed deer, on the other hand, can deal with a lot of wolf predation because they multiply very quickly. They have twins. Caribou, however, have a pretty low replacement rate. They invest a lot of resources into each calf, which makes them co-adapt pretty well with wolves when caribou populations are really dispersed across an intact landscape. And wolf populations don't get too high because there aren't that many caribou in any given place to sustain them. But with all the changes we brought about to the boreal forest, the dynamics are really changing. So wolves, this is Puckasaw National Park in the Canadian North Shore of Lake Superior. Caribou can still find refugia from predation in deep snow, in these windswept barrens, dense bogs, and very rocky coastlines. And unfortunately, here are some of the islands. There's Michipicoten Island. I hope you can see it. And by that winter of 2018, the population had crashed from several thousand to only about 20 stuck on this island here, and changing ice cover limited their movement and the wolves' movement on and off the mainland. So there we are. So the tribe, the First Nations community, and other really interested people in the region said, hey, we can't just let these last caribou fragmented population go extinct. We need to reconnect them with the other populations, and we need to just get them off the island where they're trapped with the wolves. As one person said, it's like being in an elevator with a madman with a machine gun. I was, you want somebody to open the elevator door so you can get the heck out of there. So community members led by Gord Eason is the man on the left. He was retired ministry biologist, Gord Eason. Here's Leo Lapiano in the middle, and Christian Schroeder. And then Brian McLaren, I worked a great deal with, of Lakehead University. They urged the Ontario ministry just to save these woodland caribou. Options included picking up some of the island wolves and bringing them to Isle Royale, where they could be really useful in the attempt to restore genetic diversity to Isle Royale wolves. But that process was going to take too long. It eventually has happened, but at the time it couldn't happen fast enough to save this last population of caribou. So the other options were to kill wolves, which wasn't going to happen, And if nothing else, just to pick up the caribou in helicopters and bring them to islands without wolves, to give them a chance to repopulate and to be able to spread out on their own when ice formed again back to mainland. So at first the ministry said, no way, we have to let this be wilderness. We can't touch these animals, even though they'd been moved around a lot in the past. They said, no, right now we have to have a 10-year process to bring in multiple stakeholders before we can take any actions. And everyone said, look, we've got maybe 10 days before they go extinct. We have to do something. We have helicopters, we have volunteer biologists from all over the world. Let's just save these caribou. And then the ministry said, no, it'll be much easier if they just go extinct. Because if they did go extinct, it would open up a big chunk of territory, basically, to oil and gas development, is at least what the Michipicoten First Nations community thought. But finally, the Caribou Coalition started talking to the media, and these are some headlines from the New York Times, the Star, a bunch of newspapers all around the world, and the ministry was shamed into doing something. So 3 dramatic interventions that winter. Biologists captured caribou in big nets and helicoptered them over in some dramatic interventions. They moved them over to what's known as the Slate Islands archipelago. If anybody's a kayaker, it's a really extraordinary place to kayak, and others to Caribou Island. And here's some images of the caribou being released, a very happy caribou running. So here's an image of they were moved from here over to Slate Island. This is the north shore of Lake Superior, and then down to Caribou Island, which not surprisingly, because the name suggests they used to have caribou there. So that summer, along a remote beach here in the Slate Islands, biologists found the prints of a caribou calf, which meant not only were they persisting, but they had managed to calve. The pregnant female had managed to calve. They didn't realize she was pregnant. And for now, the caribou appear to be thriving on the Slates and Caribou Island. But we need to do something. Extinction has been averted for the moment, but there needs to be plans about restoring them. At least this green here is the habitat, where what used to be their habitat on the mainland. The sliced up area right here is what's called the discontinuous distribution. This is where they've been extirpated by oil and gas and industrial forestry development. And then the range continues up north. So there's this big gap. And so the efforts are to try and bring them back to the mainland so they can, once again, begin migrating and begin to re-inhabit their former range. But the larger question a lot of people are asking, what lies in wait for woodland caribou in an industrialized, warming world? Are we going to keep doing these last minute interventions to save them from the brink over and over again? And does it make sense to save them if they're doomed to extinction anyway, as some in the ministry say? So, a little bit of background about the declines. Caribou and indigenous peoples and wolves managed to coexist for millennia after the ice retreated. But when settlers and colonists came from Europe, unfortunately, familiar history unfolded. The first stressor was really intense hunting. Caribou were targeted actually first by elite recreational white hunters, really wealthy people like Teddy Roosevelt, president at the time, because they were perceived as incredibly difficult and sporting to kill. And you absolutely needed a native guide. They said, help of a native guide was required. So caribou populations began to decline from this pretty intense hunting pressure. And the wealthy elite whites actually blamed the native guides and forbade them to hunt caribou, but didn't limit their own hunting or their extractive industry development, which was beginning. So I have a grad student, Jordan Kelly, who I'm not sure if he's on now, is doing really wonderful work looking spatially at the advance of mining and forestry and other industrialization and what that meant for caribou populations. So, as Europeans began to expand in Canada, the fur trade, the mining, the logging, habitat for woodland caribou, but more important, refugia to get away from their predators began to diminish. And so all of a sudden I'm not advancing. Here we go. And here's that extirpation. So here is 1850. They actually went pretty far south in Michigan. And then by 1900, they'd been pushed north, although they still were here in the UP along the southern shore. And then by 1950, the yellow line, they're getting pushed further north, although this remnant population is persisting as it's a pretty wild coast and there's a lot of little islands and some national parks. And then by 1990, pushed still further north. So I want to talk a little bit about a pretty amazing restoration effort. I said people have been trying to save these animals for at least almost 100 years. And so if we look a little bit at this restoration program in Minnesota, where they persisted in a really healthy population in the northwestern part of the state, right here in the big bogs, we can learn a lot about why they have struggled so much. So the Big Bog, I hope some of you have gone there. It's an amazing place. It's one of the biggest peatland habitats left in North America. And by the 1930s, the Big Bog herd was the last woodland caribou persisting in the US at the time. And in 1938, the bog became the site of the first recorded North American effort to translocate woodland caribou. In other words, to do what they had to do on the Slate Islands a couple of years ago, pick them up and move them instead of letting them go extinct. So as I said, one of the largest peatland complexes in the world, some 3 million acres of peat that formed when glacial lakes drained. And Indigenous peoples had thrived in the Big Bog region for millennia. The Treaty of 1863 had forced the Red Lake Nation, Anishinaabe, to cede substantial portions of their territory, over 12 million acres. But they were really careful to retain both Red Lake and the Big Bog, where they fished for lake sturgeon, used numerous wetland resources, and particularly nurtured wild rice and coexisted with their caribou, who they saw as kin. They hunted them, of course, for meat, clothing, and shelter, but also saw them as core spiritual beings. And so an image here, this was the Greenlands here were ceded in the 1863 treaty. And then this is what remained after a series of treaties. And in my book, I go into some really sad detail about the ways, or not sad, some really inspiring detail about the ways the Red Lake Nation really insisted on retaining rights to their land and sovereignty and fighting against the attempts by Minnesota to drain these huge bogs and sell them off to whites for development. So woodland caribou wintered in these bogs, migrating north across what eventually became the US-Canada border to calve on islands up here in the Lake of the Woods area to find protection from wolves and bear. And so their migrations were disrupted by intense development, hydropower, paper development along this Rainy River border, International Falls. And so they were cut off from much of their habitat. And so they were sort of in some ways their range was restricted to this small area within the bogs. Logging crews that came into this region began to target the migrating herds to feed camp crews, often killing hundreds at a time. And so in the 1860s, as the caribou migrated southward, they were shot in thousands and thousands per winter to supply meat for logging camps, and whites blamed the tribal members of the Red Lake Nation for the decline rather than blaming the loggers who were supplying the logging camps. So they passed a set of laws that criminalized all tribal hunting of caribou. And then in 1889, Minnesota's Nelson Act ordered all Anishinaabe people within Minnesota to relocate to a different reservation, to the White Earth Reservation, so whites could farm the Big Bog area. At that point, the elders of Red Lake just said, nope, we are not doing this. We're not leaving Big Bog or Red Lake. This is home. So they were forced to cede over 3 million acres of that land outside the bog in return for annual payments. But paternalistic policies ensured that whites, rather than tribal leaders, would decide how those funds could be spent. And so here's the tribe. In 1908, Minnesota passes the Volstead Act, says, we're going to drain the bog. We're going to drain all the swamplands, get rid of the stupid swamplands so we can have farmers. And White said that drainage was going to benefit the Red Lake Nation by making them into settled farmers instead of hunters and gatherers. And so they said, we're going to use your funds to pay for the project. And tribal leadership said, absolutely not. They took it all the way to Supreme Court. They said, you cannot use our funds to fund a project that would destroy the bog, the Red Lake, and our way of life. And their appeals failed. And so the drainage project, on using Red Lake Nation funds, moved forward. 1,500 miles of ditches were dug over 6 years. The drained peatlands dried, then burned. Lake sturgeon, wild rice vanished. Caribou drowned in those drainage ditches. Survivors, the few that survived, retreated ever deeper into the bog. Farms failed. Homesteaders defaulted. It was the Great Depression. The whole thing was a complete disaster. Minnesota declared the project a disaster, but 1930, but rather than return the lands and the funds to the Red Lake Nation, Minnesota instead established the 1 million acre Red Lake Game Preserve and said, hey, let's restore caribou. So they said, and they, it's really moving reading their reports because they really love caribou and they were so afraid they were about to go extinct. So they started restoring caribou habitat by blocking drainage ditches, reflooding the peat bogs, dynamiting the wallows. But the caribou, their population shrunk and shrunk. Just first only 13 remained, then just 3, all cows. And so at that point in 1936, the head biologist, Gustaf Swanson, an amazing early wildlife biologist, asked why hunting regulations and habitat protection was utterly failing in the case of woodland caribou. And so the fundamental problem, he argued, was development had ended caribou migrations. But then he said, and it wasn't due to tribal hunting, but he said, but tribal hunting right now is frightening us too much. So he said the tribes can't control themselves from hunting. So he said we have to build a 22-mile long fence that would completely block what remained of caribou migrations. He said, quote, to save the animals from wandering into the Indian reservation while they'll be in constant danger, the only solution is a fence. So even though he recognized it was them not being allowed to migrate all, up back to Canada, he said, we're so afraid of Indians, we're going to make it even worse. So they built a fence between the reservation and the game reserve, but it didn't work. And now the population's about to go completely extinct. So in 1938, they said, we're going to try this experiment in translocation. We're going to go to Saskatchewan, hire a lot of First Nations trappers because we have no idea how to find or trap caribou, and the Indians are the only ones who know. And we're going to bring them down to Minnesota to save them, but we're going to keep the fence there because we don't want them wandering off and getting poached by Indians. And so I tell this story, and it's really moving in some ways because these biologists were really amazing biologists. But the project failed. The caribou did not do well, trapped inside a fence, not allowed to migrate. And just because even though the biologists knew it wasn't tribal hunting that was devastating woodland caribou, rather the destruction of migration corridors and over industrialization of the forest. But because whites just couldn't imagine that Indigenous peoples could coexist with their caribou kin, rather than restoring migration routes or restoring more of the forest corridors, the migration corridors, biologists said, we're going to fence in caribou. So my argument here was caribou loss is part of a much larger context of Indigenous dispossession from lands, from bogs, and most of all, dispossession from the right to decide how to live their lives, how to negotiate relations with their kin, their caribou kin, and how to control their own money and their own wetlands above all. So the sad thing is by perpetuating the racism that underlay much of the dispossession of tribes from the bogs and the loss of caribou habitat, wildlife biologists unfortunately really doomed the restoration to failure. And one of my larger arguments is restoration is really core, but it's so essential for us restoration ecologists and people, environmentalists really passionate about restoration, to really try and pay attention to some of the ideas about wilderness and indigeneity that kind of underlay that. Modern restorationists can still replicate some of those ideas without realizing it. So after World War II, things got a little harder for caribou. In Ontario, where they had persisted, there was just massive industrialization to try and turn the boreal north quite explicitly into a white landscape. And planners were really explicit. They said, it's only First Nations communities. We want to bring whites to this community. So they built these massive pulp mill towns like Terrace Bay. And it just intensified. Paper industry development, hydro development, extraction, mining, received enormous funds of provincial and federal support in Canada, required enormous sums of capital. They didn't just happen on their own, in other words, and they really transformed boreal bogs and watersheds and the species that depended on them. And Indigenous peoples really resisted those developments, as they often continue to do today. So that's part of the theme of the book, the successes that many of the First Nations communities have had in reshaping development. So this gives an image of, this was just from 1989 to 2001, an image of forest fragmentation in the boreal forest, in the southern boreal, which is the most productive for logging. The orange, anthropogenic change, mostly that's logging. So this is caribou habitat, basically. Right here, the gray is caribou habitat, and you can get a sense of just how extraordinarily fragmented. So right here was where caribou persisted in the provincial parks that are not as fragmented, and they've just been really eliminated from this area. It's become a patchwork of pulp and paper development and mining development that increases habit access for caribou. So here we are, climate change is really affecting the trade-offs Canadians are making between caribou range and extractive industry projects. I actually thought when I went and started interviewing project managers and ministers who were working for various Canadian ministries, I thought that given their recent promises to protect boreal forests and also to protect caribou, the government would begin to favor caribou habitat over extraction, at least on public lands. But it actually seemed to be just the opposite. It was really sort of surprising. And part of it is many many policymakers within the ministry believe that climate change is inevitably going to kill caribou, so they're doomed, said one headline. And so, as one ministry biologist told us, climate change is going to wipe them out anyway, so why expend resources to save them? And here are some of those headlines. And I'm not really going to talk about, with climate change, we're losing some of the winter lichens that are really important for caribou, but not absolutely essential. We're also increasing access for white-tailed deer expanding their range into the northern half of Lake Superior, where they didn't used to be. And they bring a parasitic brainworm that doesn't kill them, but is pretty devastating for moose and caribou populations. But the interesting thing about caribou is that they can adapt really quite well to climate change if they're allowed to migrate. Caribou, unlike moose that really don't forage very well as temperatures warm, woodland caribou don't experience thermal stress until about 35 degrees Celsius. Which is much warmer than we're predicted to be at any time. So there's no reason that a caribou, unlike a moose, can't adapt to climate change or can adapt by moving north. Lichens are really important, but caribou can actually use other winter habitat if necessary. On Michipicoten Island, where they've really thrived, there's actually a mixed forest dominated by maple, and caribou have thrived there when there weren't high wolf populations. So my point here is, even if we do lose much of the lichen, we're not necessarily going to lose caribou. It's not like they can't forage at all in changing habitats. And caribou historical responses to past climate change offer some clues and some hope to how caribou might respond if they're allowed to migrate, if they're allowed to move. So they were actually one of the few large species, the really big so-called megafauna, to actually expand rather than go extinct in the late Pleistocene. And they survive repeated glaciations by moving. And boreal woodland caribou, as I said before, went to the Appalachians. And the interesting thing is, as caribou adapted back and forth by moving north at the end of the last glacial maximum, people followed them. It was caribou that made human life possible in a warming north. It was all those wonderful archaeological work that's going on now in the Mackinac Straits and across Lake Huron, finding these sites where people were able to move north because they partnered with the caribou kin. They hunted them, and that allowed them to move north. And anthropologists are interpreting this climate history as, the fact that caribou can be extraordinarily resilient. Anthropologist Piers Vitebsky argues that caribou made human life across the subarctic and the boreal north possible as climates warmed so quickly in the late Pleistocene, allowing people to thrive in ecosystems that would have otherwise been uninhabitable. So as caribou moved north, people developed this extraordinary range of diversity of human-animal relationships with these incredible species. So say Mongolia, where I've done some work, tribal peoples fully domesticated reindeer, but still respected them as spiritual individuals. In Sami, in what's now in Sapmi, which is now northern Sweden and Finland, peoples developed semi-domesticated, very close relationships with reindeer. Reindeer and caribou are the same species. So these domesticated ones are woodland caribou, essentially. So they semi-domesticated them, followed them in huge herds, guarded them, protected them from wolves, but it was really the reindeer who chose where to go and the people following them. And then Anishinaabe, where wild caribou hunters did not domesticate, but saw them as really close companions and kin. And the Gwich'in, many of you have heard with the Barren Ground caribou fighting to protect Arctic National Wildlife Refuge from oil development, also had extraordinary close relationships based on hunting and spiritual values. So from this variety of relationships across human and non-human, people gained resilience in a changing environment. And now we're finding out, scientists are finding out that caribou and reindeer can be really important partners in efforts to mitigate warming climates. So for example, for hundreds of years, even now, Europeans in Scandinavia tried to control and dictate the size of grazing herds of reindeer that the Sami, the indigenous communities, could manage, assuming that reindeer were always damaging wilderness, always being overgrazed, always destroying northern vegetation. Same thing happened in Mongolia, where I worked with indigenous tribal nomadic communities who are now forbidden to graze their reindeer in most boreal montane landscapes. But European scientists are finally beginning to realize what indigenous peoples have been telling them all along: reindeer grazing actually helps the North fight climate change. It turns out that grazing, these herbivores in the Arctic, actually favor rather than destroy grasses, because the caribou and reindeer are browsing back the shrubs. And these shrubs, as they expand in a warming north, are absorbing more and more solar radiation. But the grasses that are favored by reindeer grazing actually increase albedo, cool temperatures locally, and probably across the entire Arctic. I hope that makes sense. I'm happy to explain it in more detail. But basically, the shrubs warm the climate, and caribou are eating them back, and the grasses that come up instead, the native grasses that come up instead, act as giant umbrellas, basically reflecting the sun and cooling the climate. And what's sort of interesting is indigenous peoples have telling them all this all along: grazing reindeer helps the ecosystem. It doesn't destroy the wilderness. So one of the things I argue is that when we talk about woodland caribou as too vulnerable to be sustained in a warming world, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Climate change isn't going to destroy caribou, but policy decisions might. I argue that that restoring any species really requires close relationships. It requires heart, you might say. And it requires us to think creatively about new strategies in a changing world. The kind of translocations that we saw with the Lake Superior population, the kind of assisted migrations that Sami and Duka people, Satsin people, Aveni people, people across the Arctic have been practicing with caribou, protecting them from predators, walking with them on migrations. Those may become increasingly necessary in a warming world. Our cultural beliefs about wildness often collide with that. But I argue that, for woodland caribou and many species in a warming world to thrive, it's time for us to rethink assumptions about the need for continuing human stewardship of migratory wildlife in a warming world. And as history tells us, people and caribou have had really intertwined histories, and our caribou relations may now require continuing care, a need to invest our heart and also our time and resources and money to manage the predators, to protect the migrating herds and their calving grounds, to translocate individuals when populations are at risk, and to expend the resources above all to decrease industrialized development in the boreal forest. So I think there's a lot of hope, and that hope comes from working closely with Indigenous partners across species boundaries, across cultural boundaries. And in the caribou chapter, I talk about much more hopeful, in the sturgeon chapter, I talk about very, very hopeful examples of that. So I hope we have time to have questions or conversation, and I will stop sharing the screen. Whoops, I forgot to say thank you, everybody. And thanks to the various groups who've been kind enough to fund this research on this book, as I traveled around the world to do much of this before COVID hit. Then I got to stay inside a room. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Langston. It's an enlightening talk. And before I say anything more, Evan, do we have anyone who has questions?
I did have a comment for you here from our Facebook from Joy Langston. So great to hear you, Professor Langston. 1.6 million years. Can you talk more about the ancient history?
Hi, Joy. That's my sister. That was nice of you to join in on Facebook. Yeah. During the ice ages, ice advanced and retreated over and over and over again on cycles. And people were able to persist during this time because we followed caribou basically to refugia. In Europe, it was in France where those extraordinary caves are that I hope someday to go to, if you can see them without destroying them. And then as it warmed, caribou picked up and started moving north, and people followed them across. And this happened in North America and in Europe and in Asia. It was really, Piers Vitebsky, I don't know if Roman Sudorsov, who did his PhD with Piers in Cambridge, but worked across Siberia and the Arctic, was just, there's just extraordinary work about how long these relationships between people and caribou have gone on and how vital they've been to humans as well as to caribou. It's really inspiring. And somehow wolves and bears and lynx managed to coexist as well. So there's a lot of talk about, we have to kill wolves in order to have caribou or deer or elk persist. I think in short term, in some populations, that may be necessary, at least translocate wolves or translocate caribou. But certainly if they coexisted for millennia, they can co-evolve or coexist again today, if we make that possible for them. Thanks, Joy.
Is there anyone who's listening on Zoom who would like to ask a question?
Well, feel free to add those to the chat if you'd like to. One thing I really appreciated the way that you always take these subjects and make them both personal and also cultural, spiritual, like you hit all those dimensions to show how important all this is. How did you first get interested in this subject of caribou? Like, what led you to writing this book?
Drinking caribou coffee? No. Actually, to be honest, when I was in Sweden, I spent a year in northern Sweden with my husband, as I was the King's professor in Umeå, Sweden. And I was working on sustaining Lake Superior at the time, but I thought, well, I'm there, I might as well sort of get to know some of the environmental questions. And a lot of it is, of course, boreal forest industrialization that is of concern, loss of wetland habitats. loss of stream connectivity. But then Umeå University was really the Sami, or is the Sami University, and it's in a winter habitat for Sami, where they would migrate with their caribou down to much more protected, or with reindeer caribou, down to much more protected places along the Baltic and the forest there. So I got to know a lot of Sami people who taught at the university or part of the university community, and learn more that there was an enormous nickel mine project about to go forward. Or there was talk about it up near Kiruna, and people just contacted, because I was working at the time on an enormous mine on the Bad River, just outside the Bad River Reservation, the GTAC mine proposal. And so people said, look, there's something very similar going on. Would you come up and talk with us about this? So I went and spent some time, a couple different times, talking with different members of Sami herding communities about the challenges they face. Wrote an article for American Scientists, and just really fell in love with hanging out with both caribou, reindeer, and much more, also very much the people who have intertwined their lives with them and are doing everything they can to protect that. So it was a real gift to be able to do that, and it really shaped my research. That and kayaking all around Lake Superior a number of times, and seeing these petroglyphs of caribou and thinking, what, there were no caribou here, they're up in the Arctic. So, and I also wanted to say, wait, Lynn, I also wanted to say that, Lynn, I'm super grateful, not just to all the people who were so generous with their time with me and telling me about their relations with caribou and sturgeon and loons. Also super grateful to Lynn Heasley, who appeared in this series a few weeks ago with their wonderful new book on sturgeon. She was so kind to write a really wonderful, generous, and very personal foreword to this book too. So thank you, Lynn. I saw she asked a question.
Yes, we do have a question from Lynn here. Lynn, if you'd like to speak, feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can pass this along. We can talk about it. All right, I'm going to read your question. Hi, Nancy and all. Suppressing flexible transhumance roots is a colonial constant. Are you? Oh, there you are. Why don't you go ahead?
No, I would like you to read it. Okay. That would be great.
So, suppressing flexible transhumance roots is a colonial constant. Are you seeing any new or hopeful alternative approaches, laws, etc., that incorporate this kind of transhuman flexibility?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you, Lynn. This definitely is Lynn's own research in Africa. Let her talk about that. Has shown it's certainly not just in the Arctic that that colonial powers have been made very nervous by people who move around and by animals who move around, which is partly on much of this project. I'm working with Casey Huckins, who's down in the Bahamas right now, a fisheries biologist at Michigan Tech. And then we have a number of grad students, and I see Zach on, who are working on different aspects of development of the northern forests and what that means for migratory species. So there's a lot of efforts that have been made to thinking about migratory birds and really trying to figure out how best to protect migratory birds rather than just protect their breeding habitat, to really think about all the places they tie together in a world. And so I think those are really hopeful for helping wildlife that migrate, but for helping people that migrate, it's actually, I think, a lot more challenging. That governments, have been pretty eager to name and number and tax people for all the reasons governments, need to raise money to do a whole host of things, provide schools, education, roads. And it's really hard to do that with populations that move a lot. Lynn mentioned transhumance, which is a different kind of migratory pattern where you move typically with grazing species to winter pastures to summer pastures. Something that almost all cultures many cultures have done, from say the Swiss, in much of the Alps, and many other cultures. And there's a lot of efforts in Europe now to restore cultural landscapes that have a lot of really valuable biodiversity, and recognizing that you have to make room for people, that people are part of those cultural landscapes. And so restoring these transhuman sort of pastoral relationships. And that was sort of a vague answer. Sorry, Lynn.
I'd like to ask a follow-up to that. So obviously, we're still really struggling here to incorporate Indigenous people properly into policies. Is it different in Finland and Sweden? I know that they're having a lot of issues there too with the Sami people and, you know, building things that are getting in the way of migration patterns, but do you see a difference in attitude about how Indigenous people are treated in Finland or Sweden?
There's a lot more racism in Sapmi and Scandinavia than here, I would say. It's in some ways much less open. The tribes here were super careful to negotiate treaties that preserved a whole set of super important rights on so-called ceded territories. And so the tribes, in exercising their sovereignty, are able to, on much of the lands, much of the, say, the 12 million acres that the Red Lake Nation was forced to cede over to whites, still have rights to co-manage on those that are public lands, to co-manage fisheries and wildlife, because they retained in the treaties rights to hunt and fish and gather. And Scandinavia has never recognized those rights, even though the Indigenous peoples believe they did retain those rights. The treaties give them much less, or gave us the wrong word, recognize much less sovereignty. The Sami do have a parliament, but they're still incredibly restricted across national borders. So their migrations went across from Norway, across Sweden, across parts of Russia, the Kola Peninsula, into Finland. And so there are some real differences in, say, you know, in the Kola Peninsula in Russia, the Sami there were really brutally repressed. Andrew Bruno wrote a really powerful book about it. And then in Finland, they have been able to regain more rights than in Sweden and Norway. So the development of the Sami parliament over the last couple of decades is important, but these national boundaries still really restrict movements, as they did between US and Canada as well. So the treaties, the ceded territories, and the recognition of sovereignty through really powerful court cases and people putting their bodies on the line, in the fishing cases here in the 70s and 80s, tribal people getting out there during the spear fishing controversies, have been absolutely essential for transforming, I think, futures, making it much more hopeful here in the US. So I certainly hope those things happen as well in Scandinavia.
I do too.
Yeah,
well,
so
we have
it's been here in the US, it's worse in Canada and Scandinavia, is what I'm trying to say, and in Russia, of course.
It's unfortunate that we keep repeating these same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah, but we can learn from them. And part of the sturgeon story is that, you know, fisheries biologists were really reluctant, European fisheries, white, whatever we want to call it, were really reluctant to really listen to tribal biologists. You know, I hate drawing the distinction between scientists and Indigenous peoples, because plenty of scientists are Indigenous, you know, and plenty of Indigenous tribal members are working really hard to get scientific degrees so they can do two-eyed seeing, bringing in both tribal understandings, such as that reindeer are really valuable kin and help protect habitat, they don't destroy it, and also scientific understandings of, say, how to, you know, implant radio transmitters so you can follow animals and their migrations. And the sturgeon work that many of the tribes are doing, that I described briefly and Lynn develops in much more detail, is really inspiring, is really doing amazing things to bring lake sturgeon back to their migratory roots in the Great Lakes. It's just extraordinary work.
Could you talk a little bit more about your own work with lake sturgeon?
Actually, how about if I answered Jace's question? Jace Ludi asked a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's go to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jace said, did the Michipicoten First Nation people happen to share anything about the history of Michipicoten Island? Asking if I learned anything about Mishipeshu in particular. People did talk with me some, but I didn't actually get permission to share those stories, Jace, so I'm not sure. Yeah, they were sort of informal conversations. So do you want to talk about Mishipeshu some, please?
Oh, yeah. understand that. I was curious, I guess. I have a particular relationship with Mishipeshu, it seems, but it also, I guess, from what I've learned of more, I guess it's settler perspectives, but the importance of as a guardian of copper kind of, I think was really interesting.
Yeah, there is so much interesting First Nations history and then Paleo-Indian history, like along the northern coast of Lake Superior, the Canadian coast of Lake Superior, and of course tensions between different groups on how to interpret continuity between these ancient histories and continuing futures. So for example, this is different than Mishipeshu, but with the tribes in Michigan doing, really working to change, to remove Line 5 from the Straits of Mackinac, and the work that their archaeologists are doing to show that through these straits that there were caribou and human migration routes, that they're really important archaeological artifacts that are part of the tribe's cultural tradition. So it's ceded territory, they're also really core sites. And so those kinds of efforts are really important in sustaining a kind of future that for everybody in this basin.
Nancy, a quick question that pops up when I was taking notes. And one is that there's a connection between the migration and the reproductive strategies of the three animals that you picked for your book. They all have long periods before they reproduce. They reproduce in small numbers. And then with migration, you have this issue that their patterns conflict with ours. And so, if these animals are to succeed, as you mentioned, the ability to move, but also the ability to reproduce in a uninterrupted way it seems to be essential for them. And it seems like you would think that perhaps they would start changing their reproductive strategy so that they would be able to have a better chance to succeed. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to unmute myself. Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I might defer that to evolutionary biologists who work on caribou. There's an enormous amount of disagreement right now among caribou biologists about how genetically interrelated these populations are, what kind of adaptations caribou make in response to changing predation pressures. And I'm not as qualified as I should be to really answer that question. Plus, I got slightly distracted, Horst, I have to admit, because after Jace's question, I wanted to pull up one of the extraordinary petroglyphs of Mishipeshu. So, which isn't sort of, I actually saw this, it's not my picture, but I want to share that screen for a moment. Whoops, can I move this? Hold on. Here we go. Can you see Mishipeshu? So this is, you might have heard of it as underwater panther. These are the great petroglyphs, the Agawa petroglyphs on the north shore of Lake Superior in Lake Superior Provincial Park, just north, an hour or two of Sault Ste. Marie. And there are these extraordinary paintings all over the rocks of Anishinaabe peoples, their caribou, and this is what is translated as the underwater panther, the great kind of serpent, or Mishipeshu, which is a sort of spiritual being that's been interpreted by different people in lots of different ways as the power of the lake, as the great monster of the water, as the protector of the people. But so the people that I traveled with do still offer tobacco before setting off on a water journey as a gift to Mishapishu to keep the big wave, to keep Mishapishu from getting annoyed and splashing his tail or her tail and causing huge waves that overcome your boat. So that's not, anyway, so yeah, Mishapishu is still somebody that one gives tobacco, offers tobacco to, but so sorry, horse, I was distracted. I knew there was a picture online that I could find of that amazing petroglyph, because I was afraid that some people might not know what Jace was talking about.
Oh, okay, well, that's great.
Yeah. So what are caribou's long-term evolutionary windows or possibilities for the future in a changing world? I mean, they adapted by changing their migration lengths to earlier, intensified predation and cutting off. They adapted by, a lot of whites always describe them as wetland dependent species. Earlier records showed that they moved over a much wider range of habitats, but when under very heavy predation pressure, they move to places, especially calving on places that's really hard for predators to reach. And wetlands, bogs were a really good place for that. There have been lots and lots of adaptations of subpopulations to different snow depths. Some of the subpopulations, the so-called mountain boreal or woodland caribou, have evolved very different pad shapes, and so they sink less into the snow and can carve away more of the ice. So adaptations to changing predator pressure are seen certainly in different places that they go to find refuge from that. Sorry, I got distracted when you asked that question.
Well, it's just interesting that these species are able to at least partially recover because of all the work that biologists have done, and also the native communities. So as long as we have those kinds of supporters, they will retain a presence on our planet. The question is, are they going to be more abundant, or are they going to be ghosts, as you say in your title of your book, and so the question is what will happen with them as the climate warming increases their need to go further north, and from what I've seen in photos, Hudson Bay, it's basically a rock in the summer, and not much else. So it's going to be a challenge for them in terms of food as well in the future.
Yeah. In caribou, in terms of food, are not going to, at least within any ranges of climate change that are modeled for the next century. If they could migrate, they wouldn't have trouble finding food. I mean, in fact, right now, much of the very northern boreal is not ideal woodland caribou habitat. And there may actually be increased woodland caribou habitat as it warms, just as the boreal forest potentially begins to shift somewhat north. The real problem is fragmentation and industrialization of that, rather than I suppose one of my biggest points of this book is climate change is terrifying. It's enormously important, but it also becomes an excuse for just pulling back and letting things go extinct right now. I mean, I was really astonished that the ministry was doing that, or seemed to be doing that. And there's just a lot of talk about, oh, they're doomed, so let's not bother to save them. And an argument I make about common loons is we've done enormous work to protecting breeding habitat, particularly in northern lakes that were under so much stress from lakeshore development. I mean, people almost loved loons to death by, expanding after World War II into all the sort of Minnesota lake, Michigan lake, Wisconsin lake habitat, Canadian lake cottages, and, made these lakefront riparian areas all tidy and lawn-like, and then brought out jet skis and power boats and basically devastated the loons that they were coming to get closer to. And so there's been great restoration of those habitats, a lot of volunteer groups to sort of stop harassment of loons and slow speeds down, lower wakes. The wildlife refuges such as CNE have done really extraordinary work with controlling the kind of water releases to really help lakes from getting swamped out. All those are really important, but some of that work sort of forgets that loons are migratory species. They spend much of their lifetimes down in the Gulf of Mexico or off the south coast of the Atlantic Ocean, where some of the world's most intense oil development is continuing. And loons become sort of canaries in the coal mine through their migrations. They bring these toxics up into the north, and they die from ingesting these toxics during oil spills and during ordinary oil production. So when we think of loons just as creatures of this great remote northern wilderness, I think it's easy to forget that we need to work as much for their other parts of their life cycle and really, end oil development as soon as we can, or at least restrict it in these migratory species habitat, because just ordinary oil traffic is just really hammering many coastal shorebirds, water birds, and loons are the big, sexy, beautiful, amazing ones around here that are symbols of wildness for so many people, but they should also be symbols of that we're connected with urban environments, and that just protecting wilderness is not enough to sustain life in a warming world. And I'll jump off my soapbox horse. I'm not telling you anything you don't know.
Well, I think this is a good point in which to say that if you really want to find out more about loons, get your book, because it's things that I never knew about loons, that I had, because I haven't really studied them, but it's interesting to realize how much they migrate, and considering the size of the bird, it's amazing. I mean, it's different when you have these little birds that are about like this, and they're flying kind of coasting along on their own jet stream. But loons, I don't think have that luxury. So that's why it's so interesting to realize that they're endangered wherever they go.
Yeah, and loons are so amazing, because I also hadn't realized till I started working in this book that loons were incredible targets of persecution. They were seen as the wolves of the bird world because they ate fish. Basically, people get pissed off at anything that eats fish. So they, many Europeans, targeted lake sturgeon, which, were like salmon in the Pacific Northwest for indigenous communities. They're vast. They can live for hundreds and hundreds of years. They migrate. They bring the abundance of, different habitats up into all sorts of amazing places. And Europeans and Americans just, at first just killed them in millions, because just killed them and left them to rot because they were getting in the way of their fishing. Sturgeon don't eat that many fish, but what they do is they rip up the nets of commercial fishermen. And then, millions of them were, after they were killed and left to die, somebody realized that you could power steamships with their dead bodies. And so they became fuel for steamships coming up and down in the Great Lakes. And I can't imagine how stinky that must have been, burning, rotting sturgeon. And then they were, exploited for their caviar as fake Russian beluga caviar. And it was, Europeans just saw them as a pest because they didn't like the way they tasted unless they were smoked. And Europeans saw loons as a pest because they ate fish, and they symbolized to Europeans this sort of wild, woofy terror. So one of the hopeful things is that we've really shifted our views on these animals from being evil because they compete with us, but we still have a long ways to go to, I tell some stories in the book of, some people I met at bars out west who would, like, once they had a couple drinks, would start telling me these stories about wolf packs numbering in the hundreds and hundreds, and wolves that were 200 pounds bigger than a man that would take down, 150 caribou in a night. And I'm just like, whoa, these are like IT guys in the suburb of Boise who are like, sure, this is true. So nice guys. Remember when you could hang out with strangers at a bar and tell stories? Those were the days. But anyway, but these myths are still part of the way people look at the world, I think. So I'm glad to see some of these myths are beginning to change. So Connie, it's nice to see your little black box on the Zoom screen. I'm living in Connie's house.
Okay, well, I think it's an opportunity to thank you again for taking the time to speak to us and to our members, and hopefully that we'll be seeing another book in a few years that says From Ghosts to Reality.
That says what?
Go from ghosts to reality.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm working on a book on reindeer translocations around the world. They're really wild. Or that's a funny term. They're really fascinating. And also one on successful bird restoration, because we have to have a happy book. So thank you, those of you who are still there. And it was great to, hey, Connie, like your background.
Mm-hmm.
This is, does anybody recognize what I have in the back of the picture?
Sunflowers.
Sunflowers in honor of Ukraine. I stole my husband's yellow scarf too, in honor of Ukraine. So thank you so much. I'm not sure, Kathy and Jeff, if you had anything you wanted to ask, or just sticking around to say goodbye.
Thanks again for.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that program.
Oh, Kathy, there you
Yeah.
are. I was about to say, and then Kathy Brosmer did this amazing work on loons too. And there you are. Hey, Kathy.
Just found a story.
Sorry.
Just found a story for you.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing you on Zoom in a little while, Jeff Towner. See ya.
Thank you. Thank you for a great program.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for coming. Thanks,
Okay.
Horace and Evan, for
Thank
organizing.
you. And Evan, we have a little bit of advertising we have to do, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, you're advertising for this. Okay. Sorry.
Yes.
I was saying goodbye to everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you again.
11th and 12th. Is this going to be in person or is it going to be by Zoom?
It's going to be by
Virtual.
Zoom, just like this.
Oh, okay. Great.
So it's coming on the 11th and 12th. That's
Boy, that's soon.
Evan.
Next week.
Okay. So I'm getting my dates mixed up these days. It's going to be focusing on two major areas. One is on environmental education, which will be brought to you by the Lake Superior Stewardship Initiative, which is out of MTU. And then also there's going to be a big panel on wolves, and by John Vucetich on the wolf work that he's doing. And then we will also have a talk by the chairwoman of the Females Indian Community, Whitney Gravel, and she'll be talking about treaty rights. So you gives you an opportunity to figure out what treaty rights are and all the challenges that Native Americans have to getting them enforced. And then Jen Hill will be talking about energy, and you didn't know it, Jen is now running for representative in the 109th district, which is just east of us in Marquette County. So oh, and one other thing, we're going to be talking about the wilderness designation that's being sought for the Ottawa National Forest areas of south and east of the Porkies. So it's going to be a wide-ranging program, and it gives you an opportunity to celebrate, which is what it's about. You know, that we are succeeding and not gloomy and doomy as we tend to want to be because of all the challenges that we face. So challenges that turn into a winning strategy. So please join us. If you can't write this down, all you have to do is put upenvironment.org, and you will find it on our homepage. So thank you. Evan, anything else we should let our audience know?
Rewild the UP, that's our theme for this year.
Oh,
We
yes.
have keeping the UP wild and rewilding. It'll be a great show. So please come.
Okay.
Sounds great. Okay, I'm gonna go have a drink. So
All
great
right.
to see you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you again, Professor Langston. That was a fantastic talk.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye now. Bye, everyone.